American history, there's some dark stuff from way back when. Not even that far ago.
But you won't find it in textbooks because they've tried to erase it. They? Who knows? Let's find out.
All right, so this first one is completely nuts. At one point, the CIA came up with a plan to take out Fidel Castro with an exploding seashell. I am not making this up for clicks. I know it sounds like Saturday morning, like cartoon lunacy, but this really did happen. The US government attempted to take this guy's life apparently hundreds of times, and he just kept managing to dodge the attempts. They started getting pretty creative. I mean, they had to at some point. Exploding cigars, a poisoned diving suit, poison in face cream. The list goes on, but the exploding seashell has to be one of the strangest, and I want to say ill thought out. Like, listen to this plan and tell me it's not a bit of a stretch. So Castro was an avid diver, so the CIA rigged this brightly colored conch shell with an explosive and placed it in one of his favorite diving spots. So the hope was that he'd go to this particular diving spot, find the shell, decide to pick it up, not to mention someone else could have dove into that spot first and found the shell. So yeah, this plan was scrapped for very good reason.
Speaking of completely nuts, up next we have a pretty nasty experiment that took place between 1913 and 1951 and involved testicular transplants. During that time, eugenicist Leo Stanley was the chief surgeon at San Quentin State Prison, aka Cali's oldest correctional facility. The guy was a freak. He started off his career by performing vasectomies on inmates, but soon turned his interests elsewhere. He became fascinated by the effects of aging, believing that decreased hormones contributed to criminality, weak morality, and poor physical attributes. His solution? Yep, trading testes. Stanley began using the testicles of executed male prisoners and transplanting them into older men in an attempt to restore their masculinity. Guess what? It gets worse. Apparently so many people signed up for this treatment that Stanley ran into an issue. He had a supply shortage. His solution? Animals. Oh, but wait, there's more. Eventually Stanley got lazy, and so instead of performing a proper transplant, he instead ground up the animals' parts into a paste, and then he injected that paste into the men's abdomens. Procedure count? 10,000. Wacko nut job? Yes.
Alright, next up, spy cats. Yeah, that's right. The CIA also tried to train cats as spies during the Cold War. There needs to be a cartoon about this, I think. At the beginning, it could actually say, like, based on true events. Anyway, it does sound like a Ninja Turtles ripoff, but this actually was a thing. Project Acoustic Kitty was a CIA project that set out to use cats to spy on the Kremlin and Soviet embassies in the 60s. They had a vet implant a microphone in a cat's ear canal along with a tiny radio transmitter at the base of its skull so that the cat was set up to record and transmit audio. Its first mission? Eavesdrop on two men at a park outside the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. The mission was not a success. As soon as the cat was released, it was run over by a taxi. Further attempts were made. Oh God, I'm sorry. That's funny. Further attempts were made with other cats, but the problem was they were too distracted to be of any use, and nothing productive came of this $20 million project. Yeah, I mean, cats. Why cats? Like, they're just, they do their own thing, man. They're hard, you can't train them. Acoustic Kitty came to a halt in 1967. The whole thing was a complete secret until 2001 when the CIA documents were declassified.
Okay, next up we have another pretty shady dude who also worked at a prison. Oncologist Chester Southam, working at Sloan Kettering Institute during the 1950s and 60s. What made this guy so bad? Well, he has been known to inject patients with live cancer cells without their permission and against their will. He originally implanted the cells into people who had already received terminal cancer diagnosis, but of course he later went on to inject the cells into healthy subjects instead. His goal in all of this was to see how the immune system reacted to the cells. The answer, not well, albeit the healthy people had better results than those who suffered from already terminal illnesses. Eventually, the doctor went back to treating sick individuals, this time at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. But it was here that his experimentation was met with resistance, obviously, and it was revealed to the public. The result, a big, fat lawsuit, and his medical license being suspended for 1 year, which was later reduced to a probation. He continued to study and practice medicine. That's insane. What the heck?
Next up, we have nukes on the moon with Project A-11-9. So this was a secret plan developed by the United States Air Force in 1958 during the Cold War. A lot of weird stuff going on in the Cold War. The idea behind this was to detonate a nuclear on the moon. Now, you're probably wondering why anyone would want to do something like this. There were a couple reasons. The main goal here really was to demonstrate the military and technological might of the United States to the Soviet Union, who at the time were making big strides in the space race. It was basically just incredibly petty, but scientists were also curious about what would happen if a nuclear bomb exploded on the moon, I guess. They wanted to study things like the impact it would have on the surface and whether it would create any detectable effects from Earth, but the project never actually happened. It was eventually scrapped because of concerns about the potential negative consequences. People were worried about the environmental impact of detonating a nuclear space, as well as the potential political fallout. On top of all that, though, this just would have been a total waste of time. We're going to start off with an ancient Greek playwright who died at the hands of a tortoise. I'm going to call this tale The Eagle and the Tortoise, which sounds way cooler than it is. Eagle and Tortoise would also be a great name for a pub. Aeschylus was famous for his Greek tragedies. He's often referred to as the father of tragedy, and nowhere is this more apparent than in his very own death. In 456 or 455 BC, Aeschylus was visiting the city of Gela, but little did he know there was an eagle flying overhead with a tortoise in its talons. The eagle, wanting to crack the tortoise's shell so it could get to all that juicy meat, well, it dropped its prey on a rock down below. Only that rock was actually Aeschylus's bald head. Pretty hilarious way to go, and tragic. Fitting though, comedy and tragedy often intertwine. Next on the list we have the death of the ancient Greek philosopher Pythagoras. This has to be one of the funniest historical deaths I've ever read about. Pythagoras was a very smart man, an interesting man, but he did have some very strange ideas about beings. He believed that humans and beans were related, and he once did an experiment where he buried beans and observed that they looked a lot like human fetuses when unearthed weeks later, according to him anyway. So naturally from that point on, he figured that beans must have souls of their own, so harming or eating them would be incredibly inhumane and even evil. Well, Pythagoras refused to admit a man named Chilon into the commune that he'd built, where everyone would, philosophize, and they were part of this kind of group. Now, Chilon really wanted to be part of this club though, and so he rallied a mob to seek revenge on Pythagoras for refusing to let him to enter. Pythagoras ran for his life, but he soon found himself standing before a field of beans. So now he had this moral conundrum on his hands. Would he run into the field and risk crushing and destroying all these precious lives? Or would he just allow himself to be caught? Well, he chose not to cross the field, and he died at the hands of an angry, vengeful mob. Very brave, but hilariously misguided. If you ever feel like you have a hard time letting go of a grudge, you probably don't have anything on Pope Stephen VI, who held what has to be one of the pettiest, most pointless trials in history, all because he didn't like Pope Formosus. Formosus was the head of the Catholic Church from 891 to 896, and after his death, his successor, Pope Stephen VI, decided to put Formosus on trial. But the thing is, Formosus had been dead for about 7 months. In January of 897, the trial began. And did they just, use some sort of symbolic representation of Formosus in court, like prop up a painting of him or something like that? No, that just wouldn't be official enough. So Pope Stephen actually had the guy's rotting corpse exhumed from its grave, which was then propped up on a throne in the courtroom. Classy, right? Then an actual trial took place, with a deacon appointed to speak on behalf of Formosus, and the main charges against him were related to political and religious disagreements. He was accused of having unlawfully seized the papacy and of violating church laws. Formosus was found guilty, because, you know, he was a rotting corpse that couldn't actually talk and defend himself. His papacy was now invalid. His body, or what was left of it at this point, was stripped of its robes, and the fingers he used for blessings were cut off. Finally, his body was thrown into the river. This strange event is known as the Cadaver Synod, and as for Pope Stephen VI, he was eventually imprisoned and strangled to death. People weren't really a fan of this whole trial. Next up, we have the rabbit attack. Napoleon Bonaparte had huge triumphs and some even bigger defeats, like at the Battle of Waterloo, for example. But one of his defeats isn't brought up nearly as much in history textbooks, and that's because Napoleon suffered a defeat so embarrassing, so unbelievable, that he must have wanted this scrubbed from the record entirely. But I think everyone surrounding him just found it too funny to forget. In 1807, Napoleon was attacked by an army of rabbits and lost. Napoleon's chief of staff organized a rabbit hunt as a treat for the emperor and some high-ranking military officers. A large number of rabbits were gathered. Some say there were hundreds, others say there were up to 3,000. That was probably just to make him look a little bit better. I doubt there were 3,000 rabbits, but who knows. The rabbits were kept in cages around the edge of a grassy field, ready to be released for the hunt. Now, when Napoleon and his entourage arrived ready for a leisurely hunt, the rabbits were set loose, but instead of scattering in fear, the rabbits ended up charging straight at Napoleon and his men. At first, everyone laughed at the sight of all these cute bunnies hopping towards them, but as more and more rabbits started swarming, it became clear to the men that they actually needed to act. Napoleon's men tried to fend off the bunnies with sticks, and the coachmen cracked their whips to try and scare them away, but the rabbits were relentless. Napoleon eventually had to flee to his carriage, but the rabbits kept following him, some even jumping into the carriage. It wasn't until they finally rolled away that the rabbit onslaught finally ended. I'm going to tell you about a man named Bobby Leach. Leach was born in Lancaster, England in 1858. He was a daredevil, performing insane stunts like going over Niagara Falls in a barrel, and living to tell the tale. He'd also worked as a circus stunt performer before becoming a restaurant owner. Even into his 60s, he was doing stuff like attempting to swim the Whirlpool Rapids in Niagara River. He failed several times, but this actually isn't how he died. For everything this crazy man had survived, it ended up being an orange peel that did him in. Leach was on a publicity tour in New Zealand, where he slipped on an orange peel. He ended up injuring his leg, which became infected. He ended up getting gangrene, and his leg needed to be amputated, and he died about 2 months later from complications.
Starting off at number 10, vampire killings. So starting us off, we have the supposed vampire killings from the 1800s. Now, spoiler alert here, they weren't actually vampires. Well, I guess I don't know that for sure, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say they weren't. Anyways, back in the 1800s, people in New England believed that cadavers were rising from their graves at night and preying on the living. So to solve this problem, they began exhuming the cadavers. Now, some kept it simple and just turned the cadaver face down, but others jumped to more extreme methods like ripping the bones apart and rearranging them, or burning the deceased person's heart and inhaling the smoke. Apparently at the time, it was believed inhaling the smoke cured tuberculosis, though I can only imagine it made matters much worse for them. Some towns were so into the ritual that they would even hold festivals during the process and celebrate the exhumation and subsequent destruction of the corpses altogether. So while it was incredibly unsettling, they did truly believe they were vampires haunting them in the night, so I guess it gave them some peace of mind. Next up at number 9, dentures. While today dentures are made from composite resin or sometimes porcelain, during the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, those materials weren't available. But as you can imagine, people were still losing teeth at an even higher rate due to the high sugar diet, attempted teeth whitening, which was really just wearing away their their enamel instead of brightening it, and the overall lack of knowledge around hygiene, so dentures were still needed and wanted by many. So what was their material of choice? Well, for the easiest and most profitable route, many would acquire the teeth from dead bodies. Although if you had some money, you might be able to afford dentures made from ivory. Other materials were sometimes the teeth of animals or wood, but honestly, I think we can all agree that none of those sound like terribly sanitary options, considering professional physicians at the time weren't sterilizing instruments, and some didn't even believe in disinfecting prior to surgery. Next up at number 8, stained glass. If you walk into just about any old church, you'll notice the walls are decorated with beautiful stained glass. But what might surprise you is that in some of the particularly older pieces, there is a strange ingredient that helps it all come together. In 1112, a German monk wrote about the process of creating the beautifully colored glass, and as he detailed, it starts off, innocently enough, adding sand and potash at a high temp until it becomes molten. From there, they'd add a stabilizer before coloring the glass with different metallic oxides like copper, cobalt, and gold. But once the glass was cooled and shaped, the small details were added by paint. They made the paint usually from lead or copper and would then suspend it in urine. So quite literally, some of those old stained glass windows were painted with pea paint, which I mean kind of just makes me giggle if I'm honest, but it is definitely a weird ingredient to think about being in paint. Coming in at number 7, leather-bound books. Nowadays, it's unusual to even find real leather on anything, but once upon a time, the leather on books wasn't even from cows. It was from people. Called anthropodermic bibliopegi, the books were made in a similar way as they would now, but obviously with one huge difference. They used human skin instead of an animal. While there are actually only 18 confirmed books of its kind that still exist, we have no idea just how many there could have been all those years ago. Allegedly, the books were usually made from executed convicts, and during the French Revolution, there were rumors that a tannery for human skin was established outside of Paris. I mean, it kind of gives me the willies to think about it, and I'm just glad we've moved on to a different material to bind our books today. Next up at number 6, Minnie Dean. Wilhelmina Dean, or Minnie as she was often referred to, was a nanny in New Zealand during 1880 and was a well-known caretaker in her town. But something was off with the woman, and soon she began having quite the dark spot on her name and career. In 1889, one of the young people under her care suddenly died, as if out of nowhere, and initially it was viewed as a freak accident, but 2 years later the same thing happened again. Now, with 2 minors perished under her care, police decided to investigate further into the matter. After a bit of sleuthing, it was concluded that under Minnie's care, the 2 minors were as she was attempting to take out life insurance on them. Police immediately took the remaining young boy in her care, finding it in dirty clothes and drinking curdled milk. By 1895, the investigation into her crimes continued, and she was spotted trying to flee on a train with another victim in her arms. And when police searched her house, they found 3 more covered up victims. Eventually found guilty for all her crimes, she was the first and only woman ever hanged in New Zealand.
Alright, how insane is this? Nintendo was around at the same time Jack the Ripper was stalking the streets. Yeah, Nintendo's actually been around since the 80s. The 1880s. It was founded in 1889 in Japan by a craftsman named Fusijiro Yamauchi. Of course, the company really took off in 1981 with Donkey Kong and Super Mario Bros. A few years later, but they started out making handcrafted playing cards in the late 1800s. The Ripper's spree was carried out in 1888, but not only was he still being whispered about in the streets and written about in the paper at the time, but there were several killings lasting into the early 1890s that some people speculated the Ripper was responsible for. Nintendo and Jack the Ripper, 2 things I would have never associated with each other. Very weird to picture a company that feels so contemporary being around at the same time as the man who's often referred to as the first modern day serial killer. Star Wars and the Guillotine. Or guillotine. Some people say it either way. I don't know. Star Wars, one of the first modern day blockbusters. It spawned a whole new genre of cinema. It's probably the most iconic film franchise in history. Star Wars is old, by like Gen Z standards, like sure, but in the grand scheme of things, it's very modern. People are still fans to this day. Disney churns out subpar Star Wars content like every month, so it may be kind of surprising to learn that the first Star Wars movie came out the same year that France carried out its last execution by guillotine. Yeah, what a weird clash that is. A movie that helped spawn the modern special effects driven blockbusters full of actors that are still alive and working today, and an execution method that we often associate with this long forgotten time. But no, 1977 marked the end, apparently. In fact, it wasn't even abolished until 1981. 77 was just the final time it was actually used. McDonald's also has a bit of a connection to killing people, not because of how deadly the food is, but because the first McD's opened in 1940, just a year after the last public execution by guillotine was carried out in France. Keyword there being public. The one in 1977 wasn't public. How do you think folks in England traveled to check out the last public hanging in the country? By foot? Horse and buggy? Well, maybe, but another method of transportation would have been used. The subway. Yeah. Pretty weird to think about, but you could have taken the London Underground to watch England's last public hanging on May 26th of 1868. The Underground, which is now used by Londoners on the daily to get around the city, had already been operating for 5 years by then. It first opened in 1863, changing the way people traveled in London. And by 1868, public executions were still a thing, and a huge crowd gathered to watch the hanging of Michael Barrett, an Irish nationalist, outside Newgate Prison. Just imagine hopping on a tube train, which we associate heavily with modern life, to witness something as grim and old-fashioned as a public hanging. Feels like two different worlds colliding a little bit. Today we see the subway as this symbol of progress and everyday convenience, but public hangings, just like the guillotine I mentioned earlier, feels like a more dark, distant part of our history. Just goes to show that there really isn't this clear cutoff between what's old in our history and what's new. There's a lot more overlap than we often think, which I mean, of course there is. Time is just this ever-flowing thing, but it's just weird when you step back and you put it all into perspective. Does it get any more delicious than an Oreo cookie? Even in a life and death situation, I could go for one of these. Too bad those violent players on the Titanic didn't have an Oreo cookie to bite into right before playing out their last tune as the ship started to go down. Turns out they could have though. The first Oreo cookie was sold the same year the Titanic sunk. In fact, Oreo came out about a month before 1,500 people died in the accident. But as my buddy told me the day he got back from his grandfather's funeral, I did get these nice dress pants out of it, so you win some, you lose some. Now, I said the folks on the Titanic could have had an Oreo. It's not exactly true. They weren't available overseas yet. If they had made it to their destination, they could have tried one, but instead of dunking a delicious cookie in a cool glass of milk, they were dunked themselves into ice cold water, never to return. Thus is life. Cleopatra, the legendary Egyptian queen, is often, rightfully so, associated with the pyramids, but she actually lived closer to a more modern historical event than the construction of the Great Pyramids. Believe it or not, but Cleopatra lived closer to the first moon landing than the building of the pyramids in Giza. How nuts is that to think about? She lived from 69 to 30 BC, but the pyramids had been constructed long before her, from about 2550 to 2490 BC. 1969 was closer by a pretty hefty chunk. The moon landing happened 1,999 years after her death, while the pyramids were completed 2,400 years before she was born. In this same vein, the pyramids were considered ancient to the ancient Romans. That's odd to think about too. Speaking of the pyramids, let's talk about woolly mammoths. Now I know what you're thinking out there. What do these things have to do with each other? Well, there were still woolly mammoths roaming around Earth while the pyramids were being built. That's how old the pyramids really are, which is why they're often regarded as one of the most incredible wonders of the world. I mean, no wonder some folks think there's just no way human beings constructed them on their own without some sort of outside assistance from some advanced alien species or something. A lot of people think the mammoths mammoths died about 10,000 years ago, and that was that, but a small number of them survived in several places for another 6,000 years or so. In fact, a population of woolly mammoths roamed Wrangel Island off the coast of Siberia as recently as 3,700 years ago. So even centuries after the Great Pyramid of Giza and Stonehenge was completed, these prehistoric mammoths were still roaming the earth.
Kicking things off today, we have July 11th, 1991, and the Mayan calendar. On July 11th of 1991, a bunch of UFOs lit up the skies above Mexico City during a total solar eclipse. Thousands of people reported seeing a large metallic disc in the sky. Not only that, but footage of the object was captured and even broadcasted on the news. It was the first widely reported UFO sighting in Mexico City, which since that day has become a hotbed for UFO and unexplainable extraterrestrial activity. So what does this have to do with the Mayan calendar? Well, the calendar told of the July 11th eclipse, calling it the sixth son of Quetzalcoatl, and claiming that it would bring about change and cosmic awareness, which I honestly think it's safe to say it did. Whether or not the calendar accurately predicting the events of July 11th is just some strange coincidence, or if the Mayans really did mean to calculate aliens' first major coming to Earth, for now remains a mystery. But I hope not for long, because personally, I am super eager to know more.
Alright, this next one is almost too incredible to be a mere coincidence. I'd love to see someone try and break this down and have it make any logical sense. This is the story of two twin brothers separated at birth who grew up and reunited as adults, only to find that they'd basically led identical lives. They were born in 1940 and adopted into different families in Ohio. The twins had no contact with each other for nearly 4 decades, but when they finally reunited, the similarities in their lives were just too uncanny. Both were named James by their adoptive parents, which, alright, common but incredibly awesome name, and everyone named James is a winner, but, not all that crazy. There's more though. Growing up about 40 miles apart, they both went by the nickname Jim, and each brother would go on to marry a woman named Linda. After divorcing their first wives, both Jims found love again with women named Betty. Both also had sons who they each named James Allen. They also both had dogs. And what were their dogs' names? Well, one was named Toy and the other was named Toy. I'd get it if you named your dog Skipper or something like that, typical dog name, but Toy? That's odd. Both brothers also enjoyed woodworking and had a penchant for mechanical drawing. Even their choice of vacation spots matched up. Both Jims would often go to the same Florida beach. Their health habits were similar. Both had a history of headaches, smoked the same brand of cigarettes, and even gained and lost weight around the same periods in their lives. When Jim Lewis and Jim Springer finally met in 1979 at the age of 39, it was like they were looking at a slightly alternate reality version of themselves. The case of these twins is a pretty fascinating study on how much of our behavior and preferences might be hardwired into our DNA.
Next up, we have the strange life of Violet Jessup, who during her time working as an ocean liner stewardess was present for 3 separate ocean disasters, all on Olympic-class ocean liners, including one of the most famous disasters, the sinking of the RMS Titanic. On June 14th of 1991, Jessup was aboard the RMS Olympic when it crashed with the ocean cruiser HMA Hawk. The Olympic, which was at the time of the incident the largest civilian liner in the world, suffered heavy damage and flooded in the crash, but luckily it was able to make it back to Southampton and no one was killed or even seriously injured. On April 10th of 1912, Jessup was working as a stewardess on the RMS Titanic when it hit an iceberg and sank just 4 days into its maiden voyage. Luckily, she was able to board one of the ship's lifeboats and she made it safely to shore. 4 years later, on November 21st of 1916, Jessup was working aboard the HMHS Britannic when the ship hit a mine and sank in the Aegean Sea. It was the largest ship to be lost during the First World War. As the ship sank, Jessup attempted to jump to safety but instead hit her head on the ship's keel. She did, however, resurfaced, was rescued, and survived. This girl's got 9 lives, or at least 3.
Speaking of the Titanic though, let's talk about a little novella called Futility. After the sinking of the Titanic, folks were quick to point out the eerie similarities between the circumstances surrounding the real-life disaster and a fictional novella written by American author Morgan Robertson, which was written in 1898, 14 years before the sinking of the unsinkable ship. So what were the similarities? Well, the story describes a big British passenger liner called the Titan that is deemed unsinkable, but strikes an iceberg and sinks. Not only that, but the ship in the story doesn't have enough lifeboats and sinks in April in the North Atlantic Ocean. All the circumstances I listed there, other than the difference in the name of the ships, is identical to what happened in real life in 1912.
Got a sinking feeling about that one. Next up on our list today, we have the coincidental closeness of the rare Chelyabinsk meteor and the 2012 DA-14 asteroid, two incredibly rare events that occurred 16 hours apart on the exact same day, but seemingly had nothing to do with one another. On February 15th of 2013, an asteroid entered into Earth's atmosphere over the southern region of Russia and exploded, with a force equal to 20 to 30 of the atomic bombs used at Hiroshima. 1,500 people were wounded, and 7,000 buildings experienced varying degrees of damage as a result. After the explosion, the ground below was hot and the entire affected area smelled like smoke. As I said, something like this is extremely rare, and the event was also the only time in history that a meteor has been known to cause human injury. Not only that, but the meteor was not detected by authorities prior to it entering into the atmosphere. If that's not crazy enough, just 16 hours later, another asteroid named 2012 DA-14 came within 27,700 meters, 17,200 miles, of the surface of Earth, making it the closest asteroid of its size to have ever been recorded in modern times.
I'm gonna call this next story the real-life Final Destination, because it sounds like a death you'd see in Final Destination. That's a movie you've seen, right?
No.
Anyway, this guy just could not escape the fate that was waiting for him. Henry Ziegland was born in 1861 in Honey Grove, Texas. He was a farmer who began dating a woman named Charla Karras. They lived together for a time, but in 1883, Henry dumped her. This left Charla utterly devastated, and in her despair, she ended up taking her own life. Charla's brother was filled with rage and blamed Henry for her death, and he decided he was gonna take his revenge. So one day he snuck into Henry's barn while he was tending to the horses and fired at him. The bullet grazed Henry, who then pretended to be dead. Believing he had killed Henry, the brother then turned the firearm on himself. Little did Henry know, but the bullet had lodged into a tree by the barn. Now, 20 years went by, and Henry decided to cut down a tree in front of his barn. It was too thick to cut with an axe, so he opted for dynamite. When the dynamite went off, Henry was killed instantly. Not from the explosion, he was a fair distance away, but from the bullet that had been lodged into the tree 2 decades earlier.
Next up, we have the strange life of Robert Todd Lincoln, or should I say strange saving. As we all should know, the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in a theater on April 14th of 1865. What you might not know is that during his presidency, Lincoln actually bore witness to 2 other assassinations of very prominent members of American society. The first was the assassination of Elmer Ellsworth, a Union Army colonel who was killed by a hotel owner in Virginia in May of 1868, and the second was a Union Army general named James B. McPherson, who was killed during the Battle of Atlanta in July of 1864. What's cool about this is that it's not actually the weird part. What's weird is that prior to the death of Abraham Lincoln at the hands of John Wilkes Booth, Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was actually saved by John Wilkes Booth's brother, Edwin Booth. Edwin, who was a famous actor at the time, had seen Robert Todd fall between the platform and a train at a train station and quickly pulled him to safety before things got gory. At the time, Edwin had no idea who Robert Todd was, and Robert Todd later recounted the incident, saying, "I was indebted to him for the rest of my life." Pretty strange stuff.
Speaking of Abraham Lincoln, he shares some pretty uncanny similarities with John F. Kennedy. People have listed tons of coincidences between the two, too many to list here, but Some of the most famous include Lincoln and Kennedy both being elected to Congress in a year ending in 46. Then both were elected president in a year ending in 60. They both had security agents named William, who died at the age of 75. The eeriest similarities surround their deaths, though. Both presidents died after being fired at in the head on a Friday, and both were sitting next to their wives at the time. Lincoln died at Ford's Theater, and Kennedy died in a Lincoln car, which was made by the Ford Motor Company. Both had been accompanied by another couple, the male in each couple being wounded in the attack as well. And both of their successors were named Johnson. Lincoln was succeeded by Andrew Johnson, and Kennedy was succeeded by Lyndon B. Johnson. Lastly, the names Lincoln and Kennedy each have 7 letters. That's not a big one, but there's tons of others. Just read about it, it's nuts.
Next on our list, we have the striking life of Walter Summerford. And when I say striking, I mean it. Summerford was a British officer and a major in the British Army during World War I, who was struck by lightning 4 separate times on 4 separate occasions, 3 times when he was alive. The first time Summerford was struck was on the battlefield in 1981, after which he was paralyzed from the waist down. But luckily for him, after his retirement, he was rehabilitated, and after a while, he regained the ability to walk. Unluckily for him, just 6 years later, he was struck by lightning for a second time, and he became paralyzed on the right side of his body. Again, in time, he was able to regain the ability to walk and lived a normal life. Up until 1930, that is, when he was struck by lightning for a 3rd time while trying to walk through a park in Vancouver. This time he was paralyzed completely, and he remained bedridden until his death just 2 years later. He was laid to rest in a cemetery and given a gravestone that read, "In loving memory," although it's pretty hard to make it out now considering the fact that shortly after his burial, his gravestone was struck by lightning and split into 3 distinct pieces, one for each time he was struck while alive. Pretty strange coincidence.
Edgar Allan Poe is legendary when it comes to his fantastical tales of the dark and macabre, but in this case, truth was stranger than fiction because it was eerily close to a fictional work. In 1838, Poe wrote a novel called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. It's about a young man named Arthur Pym who goes on a sea voyage. In one part of the story, though, the crew of Pym's ship finds themselves in a desperate situation. They're stranded without food, so they decide to draw straws to see who will be sacrificed so the others can survive. The unlucky one is the cabin boy named Richard Parker, who ends up being killed and eaten by the others. About 46 years later, in 1884, a real-life ship sank, and their survivors were stranded at sea, and just like in Poe's novel, the men found themselves without food and decided to draw straws to see who would be sacrificed. And who was chosen? It was a young sailor named Richard Parker. Need I say more? What do you think is older, Oxford University or the Aztec Empire? Yeah, it's Oxford. It's pretty wild to think about, but Oxford University is actually older than the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, who are famous for their impressive temples and all their rich culture, they started building their capital city, Tenochtitlan, in 1325. That's the same place we now call Mexico City. Meanwhile, over in England, Oxford University had already been up and running since 1096. That's just crazy to think about. While Oxford students were hitting the books, the Aztecs were just beginning to lay the foundations of their empire. Mostly because today, Oxford is still very much around. New students arrive every year, while the Aztec Empire feels again like this long lost age where there are only these mysterious, esoteric remnants left behind. Just weird to think about. You'd probably think anyone directly associated with the Civil War died a long time ago, but that is not the case with Helen Violet Jackson. She was born in 1916 and was the last surviving widow of a Civil War veteran. And when did she die? 4 years ago. She died in 2020 at the age of 101. Helen was just a young girl during the Great Depression when she met James Bowen, a much older man who had fought for the Union in the Civil War. And by older, I mean crazy older. Helen was 17, Bowen was 93. they got married. Don't worry though, it's not as icky as it sounds. This was a purely practical marriage. Helen's family was struggling, and Bolin didn't want to go into a home. He asked Helen to marry him so she could have his military pension after he passed away. It was a mutually beneficial thing and actually happened more than you'd probably think. They cared about each other, sure, but not in that way. At least, I don't think. I hope not. Helen never talked much about the marriage. She kept it a secret for a lot of years because she was just worried about what other people would think, and I mean, fair enough. It wasn't until she was much older that she started sharing her story, revealing a personal connection to a war that ended over 150 years before she died. Mike the Headless Chicken. It sounds like the title of an adult comedy cartoon, but this is a true story. There should absolutely be a movie based on this though. Our story begins in 1945 in Colorado. A farmer named Lloyd Olson decides it's time to make some dinner, so he goes out to the yard to chop off the head of one of his chickens. Lloyd brings the axe down on a 5.5-month-old rooster named Mike, but instead of dropping dead like a normal chicken when its head is lobbed off, Mike just shakes it off and struts around like nothing happened. Lloyd's standing there probably thinking he's lost his mind, but Mike is just wandering around, bumping into things, of course, but mostly acting like a regular chicken. Turns out Lloyd had done some sloppy work and had missed the jugular vein, leaving one ear and most of Mike's brain stem intact. Instead of finishing the job though, Lloyd saw a golden opportunity. You see, there's a valuable lesson in this story, folks. Sometimes your biggest success can come from one simple mistake, like not chopping off a head properly in this instance. Lloyd starts feeding and watering Mike directly into his esophagus with a dropper, and Mike just kept on living day after day, week after week, and then word gets around, and soon enough Mike is a national sensation. Newspapers dub him Mike the Headless Chicken, and he goes on tour, making Lloyd a tidy little profit, and people pay good money to see the Headless Wonder. And Mike even lands a spot in Life magazine. He was living the high life. Mike became a legend in just 18 months, but sadly, the parties, the late nights, the fame, it was too much to handle, and he eventually choked on a kernel of corn. Finally, we have a very weird story from ancient Greece. Sounds more like something from an early 2000s gross-out comedy rather than an actual story from history. The 6th century BC philosopher Heraclitus was a major influence on philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Unfortunately for Heraclitus though, his legacy will always be stained by his bizarre and rather revolting death. That's putting it very lightly. He suffered from, at the time, what was called dropsy, where fluid accumulates in the body. And Heraclitus tried to get help from physicians at first, but he wasn't really convinced of their conventional treatments. So instead he covered himself in cow dung, which, I mean, that's an alternative. That's one way of going about it. His idea was that the heat generated from the dung would somehow help evaporate all the excess fluid in his body, but of course this did not work. There's some debate as to whether he just died of his condition, covered in excrement, or if things got even worse. Some versions of the story go that he met an even more grisly fate, becoming trapped in the dung, either because it dried up or because it acted a bit like quicksand, and when he tried to call out for help, a gang of rabid dogs rushed over and devoured him, which would not have been a very tasty meal.
Next up at number 5, radiation test subject. In 1999, a man named Hisashi Uchi was a power plant technician, and he became known for being exposed to the highest amount of radiation of any human in history. While working at the Tokamura nuclear power plant, after a lack of safety protocols, improper training, and just an overall pressure to meet deadlines, Uchi and his coworkers made a terrible error. They mistakenly mixed an incorrect measurement of radioactive materials into the wrong tank, and as you've probably figured out, it caused a near fatal burst of gamma rays. Hisashi, who happened to be the closest to the incident, was brutally injured and sent to the hospital. Once he was there, it was discovered he had no more white blood cells, so essentially meaning that he had no remaining immune system. And despite being in intense pain with a rapidly deteriorating condition, doctors kept him alive under the family's request. So for 83 days, Uchi remained alive, being used as a test subject for experimental radiation treatment by the doctors, which, I mean, in their defense was the request of the family, but still he endured several cardiac arrests, lost all of his skin, and suffered brain damage as well as organ failure. One of the last things Uchi ever said was, quote, "I can't take it anymore, I'm not a guinea pig." And then finally, one more cardiac arrest released him from his torture. Coming in at number 4, Mumia. Most widely practiced between the 12th to the 17th century, although there were a few cases in the 18th century that pop up. Mumia was widely used as a means of medicine in many European countries. Now, if you can't tell by the name, mumia is creepily just as it sounds, the use of human remains to fix a living person's ailments. It was believed by many of the top physicians at the time that ingesting certain remains prompted the medicinal power of the mummy and could cure things like coagulated blood, pain, coughs, inflammation, cramps, and even heal open wounds. Now, they didn't just sit around eating the carcass directly. Instead, they would either grind the bones into a powder and drink it from there, or drink an extracted liquid from the embalmed individual. In fact, it was so popular at one point that it's believed the reason there are so few mummies these days is because of the high demand of flesh at the time. Coming in at number 3, James Jameson. One of the heirs to the Jameson whiskey family fortune, Jameson considered himself to be an adventurer of sorts and often traveled to far-off lands, detailing the trips in his diary. In 1888, Jameson decided to head out to explore the Congo, and while there he wrote about and demanded some gruesome things from the locals. So before beginning this expedition, Jameson discovered that the area he was visiting was known to have a population that participated in the eating of other humans. Apparently, Jameson set out to witness it firsthand, which, I mean, why was that his dream? A little suspicious if you ask me, but I digress. According to Asad Farhan, who was his translator for the trip, Jameson bought a girl from a trader of slaves for a few handkerchiefs and gave her over to the tribe to be. Allegedly, he didn't pay the tribe directly, but in a roundabout way, he did sort of pay to have this girl killed. What's even more gross is that he proceeded to draw and paint watercolors of the gruesome event while it happened, which again, just wrong on so many levels. Coming in at number 2, Cambodian Barbies. You may have been taught about the Khmer Rouge in history class, but if they don't ring a bell, essentially they were an extreme communist regime in Cambodia that held government between 1975 to 1979. They were known for being extremely cruel and committed some of the most horrifying acts of genocide in history, with nearly 2 million perishing under their ruling. Now, during their radical rule, the entire country was isolated from all foreign influences. This included closing schools, hospitals, factories, banks, foreign agriculture. They believed this would stimulate the rebirth of the country, but of course, all it did was send it into desolate famine and poverty. Led by a man named Pol Pot, the people of the country could not forage for food, despite the fact that everyone was starving, and anyone who disobeyed the orders was killed. Apparently, as the people became more and more desperate, they began to turn to folk magic, turning Barbie dolls into smoking talismans for luck. Thankfully, since its dissolution in 1999, all the leaders have been jailed for their atrocities, and the people are freed from the genocidal regime. And last up, in our number 1 spot, the Rabbit Woman. Her name was Mary Toft, and in 1726 she became known throughout Surrey, England as having been the woman who gave birth to rabbits. Now, I know what you're thinking, that isn't possible. And you would be right, but still the story of how she convinced people it was real was crazy. Apparently Toft was actually pregnant at one point, but miscarried, and it could have been this that sent her into her madness. Toft began declaring that she was giving birth to various animal parts, and so her local doctor became involved in the case. At first, everyone actually believed her, as in fact a rabbit did, well, come out of her. And with a doctor backing up her claims, the king and his royal surgeon got involved. Unlike her local doctor, the king's surgeon was skeptical, and after discovering corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits and hay in their droppings, it proved the animal hadn't had developed inside Mary. Eventually, Mary Toft admitted to the hoax and explained that she had manually inserted the animals inside her to make the delivery as realistic as possible. She was immediately imprisoned for fraud, and the medical community was ridiculed for having been fooled.
Next up on the list we have the killer beard, and I don't mean like, dude, killer beard. I mean, this beard actually killed the man sporting it. The man in question was named Hans Steininger. Hans Steininger was born in 1508 and grew up to be well known in Austria. Not only did he become the mayor of his town, but he also had an incredibly long beard, measuring about 4.5 feet. Now, normally Steininger kept his beard neatly rolled up and tucked into a leather pouch to keep it out of the way, but one day in 1567, there was a big fire in the town, causing chaos and panic amongst the people. So in the midst of all this commotion, Steininger either forgot to secure his beard or it came loose, and as he hurried down the stairs, he stepped on his own beard, tripped and fell, breaking his neck. If you think the length of his beard has just been exaggerated over the years, well, you can actually see it for yourself. His beard was cut off and preserved, and it's now housed at the museum in the Austrian town where he's from. Draco, an ancient Athenian lawgiver, died in one of the worst ways. No, he wasn't set on fire, he didn't drown or endure days of grueling sadistic torment. Instead, he died being smothered in a bunch of men's sweaty clothing. Draco is known for creating a very harsh legal code, which is why the term draconian is used today to describe severe laws or rules. Draco was presenting his new policies to a crowd of wealthy Greeks one day, and these policies were incredibly strict, but for some reason the crowd was just thrilled with this guy, and their excitement turned into a chaotic celebration. In their enthusiasm, the people started taking their clothes off and throwing them at him, as people are known to do. They tossed their hats, tunics, whatever else they were wearing, which wasn't much back then, so they were now just naked. But then Draco, I guess, would have lost his balance. Everyone probably laughed and kept cheering and hurling more and more tunics on him, and Draco probably found it funny too, until he would have realized he wasn't able to move anymore or breathe. The sheer volume of tunics that were raining down on him ended up smothering him. He was buried under a mountain of garments and suffocated to death. The bear soldier. In 1942, Polish soldiers stationed in Iran encountered a young bear cub. An Iranian boy had found the cub after its mother was killed by hunters. The soldiers, part of the Polish Second Corps, decided to adopt the bear and named him Wojtek. Wojtek quickly became a beloved member of the unit. He ate with the soldiers, he'd train with them, he'd salute when he was greeted. He really liked drinking and smoking cigarettes as well. As the Polish unit prepared to join the Allied forces in Italy, though, they faced a bit of a problem. Military regulations didn't allow animals to accompany soldiers. So what did they do? Did they leave him behind? No, instead they officially enlisted Wojtek as a private in the Polish army, complete with his own paybook, rank, serial number. Wojtek would actually help out too. He'd move heavy crates of ammunition, mimicking the soldiers by standing on his hind legs and carrying boxes. After the war, Wojtek traveled with the soldiers to Scotland, where he lived at the Edinburgh Zoo until his death in 1963. Alright, Robert Liston may have been a fast surgeon, but he's probably remembered as one of the worst after an absolutely disastrous surgery led to the death of 3 people, only one of them actually being a patient. Robert Liston was a British surgeon in the 1800s. He was working at a time where there were no anesthetics, so surgeries needed to be performed fast. Now, for one, the patients would be in incredible pain, but they could also die from shock, so, in all fairness to him, time was always of the essence, but my God, he really messed up in this one procedure. He was amputating a patient's leg, but in his haste, he accidentally cut off 2 of his own assistant's fingers. The assistant later died of gangrene. Liston also accidentally swiped at a fellow doctor, cutting into his coat, and the elderly doctor, thinking he'd been now cut open, caught such a fright that he suffered a heart attack and died. And finally, the patient the guy was operating on also got gangrene and died soon after the procedure. Many countries are known for wars and great battles fought throughout history, and Australia is no exception. But what war took place in Australia, and who was it against? Well, Australia wasn't in battle with another country here. They weren't even in a war with human beings. They were fighting a battle against the mighty creatures known as emus. The Emu War took place in Australia in 1932. So after World War I, many Australian soldiers were given land in Western Australia to farm as a reward for their service, but because of economic difficulties, these farmers were facing some tough times. To make matters worse, huge flocks of emus began migrating through their farmland. The emus caused a lot of damage to crops. The farmers were desperate, and desperate times call for a bunch of emus to be blown straight to hell. So the farmers asked the government for help. In response, the government decided to send soldiers to reduce the emu population by wasting them. The war began in November of 32, but it quickly became clear it wasn't going to be easy. The emus proved to be surprisingly difficult to target. They were fast, agile. They had a knack for dispersing into smaller groups. Over the course of a few weeks, they only managed to kill a small number of emus compared to the vast numbers roaming the farmland. And after realizing that the effort was going to be ineffective, the government decided to withdraw their troops. The emus survived the war with minimal casualties, and the campaign was ultimately deemed a failure.
Next up, we have the My Lai killings, which took place on March 6 of 1968. On that day, the American military killed around 576 South Vietnamese civilians, including some of the most vulnerable members of the community, who had absolutely nothing to do with the ongoing conflict at the time. When the public learned about the atrocity, which was broadcasted in 1969 on major news networks who shared graphic images of the incident, they were not happy. The event became a major controversy, with many demanding the perpetrators responsible for ending so many innocent lives be held accountable for their actions. Platoon Commander Lieutenant William Calley Jr. was given a life sentence, but it didn't stick. At the order of President Nixon, Calley was instead placed on house arrest and then released just 3.5 years later. 26 soldiers were charged in military court, but none were convicted. The war continued until 1975 and resulted in an estimated total of 1.4 million civilian casualties in southern Vietnam.
This next one sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it isn't. Operation Northwoods. So this was a plan devised by the US Department of Defense in 1962. The basic idea was to carry out a series of deceptive and covert operations to create a justification for the United States to invade Cuba. Cuba was seen as a potential threat at the time because it had close ties with the Soviet Union. The US government was worried about communism spreading in the West, and Cuba was seen as a potential domino that could fall. So, Operation Northwoods proposed things like staging attacks on US soil and then blaming it on Cuba, hijacking planes and ships, even orchestrating violent incidents in American cities. Like, the goal was to create public outrage and support for military action against Cuba. Crazy. Luckily, this was proposed, but it was rejected by the Kennedy administration. The fact that it was even brought up, though, as a possibility is incredibly disturbing.
Next up, we have the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill. The incident took place on January 28th of that year. A Union oil rig suffered a major blowout that caused 3 million barrels of oil to spill into 35 miles of the coastline of Santa Barbara, California. The impact of the environment was catastrophic. An estimated 3,500 seabirds were immediately smothered in oil, as well as countless other marine animals. It screwed the ecosystem, the environment, and the economy. And people were pissed, rightfully so. The only good thing about the incident was that it led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which is an independent agency of the United States government tasked with environmental protection matters and efforts. But surprise, surprise, attempts to undermine the agency have been successful, and that is why we have offshore oil drilling, one of the largest contributors to oceanic environmental issues to date, other than pollution, litter, You guys know what I mean.
Operation Mockingbird was a covert operation carried out by the CIA during the Cold War. The goal of this operation was to influence and manipulate media outlets, both domestically and internationally, trying to spin things to promote certain narratives and agendas. Operation Mockingbird was involved in stuff like planting stories, manipulating news content, even recruiting journalists to act as CIA assets. The idea was to ensure that the info reaching the public aligned with the government's objective and promoting anti-communist sentiment. Now, a lot of what Operation Mockingbird did is still kinda murky, but details have come to light over time through declassified documents and investigative journalism. Now, apparently, even some journalists at the time were spied on, having their phones tapped and stuff as well.
And to finish us off, we have the highly unethical detonation of the world's first atomic explosive, Trinity, which was an exact replica of Fat Man, the explosive device that devastated Nagasaki on August 9th of 1945. And Trinity was detonated just 15 miles away from commercial farms as well as residential homes. Oh, and they didn't warn anyone or evacuate anyone in that surrounding area. So in New Mexico on July 16th of 1945, less than just 1 month prior to the events in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they went ahead and detonated the highly unstable and incredibly under-researched explosive, exposing those living nearby to over 10,000 times the recommended levels of radiation. And some of the radiation even reached all the way to Indiana, which is like 5 states over, which is crazy, which is why this incident ended up on this list.
Creepy stuff, right?
Yeah, creepy, dark, messed up, you name it.
Yeah.
We got
it. You know, what can you do?
Yeah. Not any of these, hopefully. Especially not the second one. That was gross. You guys, always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. We'll catch you next time.
Yeah. Bye.
Want to see more videos like this one? Check out this video next. This video is about photos from history that scared historians. We found some of the scariest photos in history, and these are some of the weirdest things we ever seen. What are you guys waiting for? Click the video now to find out more.